Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Professor Ksenia Shmutina, second day in a row. I can't pronounce my own name. So I'm Professor Ksenia Shmutina, I'm Director of the IAS. Welcome to the International House for those of you here with us. We also have some people online. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We are recording the presentation, and it will be released on our YouTube channel and as an audio podcast, but we will not be releasing Q&A. So if you have any questions, any comments, just feel free to post them for those of you online, and of course in the room, join us. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Gemma Sou to the Institute of Advanced Studies. Here at the IAS, we welcome interdisciplinary, curious, exciting research, and I think Gemma's research manifests just that. I've known of Gemma's research for, I don't know, a decade maybe? A long time, but kind of around that long time. And I remember finding this comic about climate change and hurricanes. I was like, oh my God, this is the most exciting thing that has ever been produced in this study. So of course I stalked her online, as you do. And we since collaborated by email, as many academics do. Gemma contributed to all sorts of crazy things that we've been leading on. And we've met once in person at the conference for kind of literally 20 minutes. So it's been so nice to have you here and to be able to talk and discuss things and just kind of have fun. So we're really looking forward to this presentation. Okay. And then, of course, there is an afternoon presentation on a completely different topic for those of you who are able to stay with us. So over to you.
All right, super duper. Thank you so much. So this isn't about comics. I actually do work in comics. It's kind of wildly different to that. But just to try and get a feel of people in the room, could you raise your hand if you work on climate change? Just so I have it's a bit of a broad church these days. Or small island developing states? No, okay. It's kind of niche, so yeah, no worries. So today I'm going to be presenting some work in progress, and apologies, I'm going to kind of be reading from a script book. I won't be like this, so bear with me because it's new work, it's a new paper. So in this work based around the Caribbean, I'm going to argue that small island developing states, or SIDS, they're not merely victims of the climate crisis, but they're actually active strategic agents engaged in a profound project of reimagining and reshaping global climate governance. So this project, I'm arguing, is a direct continuation of the anti-colonial world-making projects of the mid-20th century. So the paper, I'll start off by saying, what is the dominant story we hear about small island developing states in global climate governance? They're vulnerable, they don't have a lot of structural bargaining power. Then I'll introduce this concept of world making and how that was used to describe the anti-colonial nationalists of the mid-20th century. And then the rest of the paper is trying to say that actually what SIDS are doing today resonates, or it can be interpreted as a continuation of that anti-colonial work, that failed anti-colonial work of the mid-20th century. All right, so next slide. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the dominant story that we all tend to hear about SIDS. So the 58 SIDS from the Pacific to the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean are on the so-called front lines of climate change, and they face threats such as sea level rise, intensifying hurricanes, ocean acidification, and yet as a group they've actually contributed less than 1% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. And the dominant policy narrative coming from the global north frames this as a kind of a tragic vulnerability. The solution offered is primarily technical and financial. So let's build seawalls, let's do some early warning systems, and let's provide adaptation finance. And this framing is very seductive in its clarity, because it frames the problem as physical exposure, and it suggests it's like we just give technical solutions and that will solve the issue. But a lot of people have already written about how this narrative is also deeply political, because it isolates vulnerability from its historical roots. So the vulnerability of SIDS today, their economic dependence on tourism, often the high levels of debt burden, the inadequate infrastructure, narrow economies often focus on tourism, small agricultural and manufacturing sectors are not natural. they're the direct legacies of colonial plantation economies, of resource extraction, fueled industrialization in the global north, and left high levels of poverty and vulnerability within SIDS. And it's also a result of the post-independent insertion into a global hierarchy, a global economic order that maintained unequal relationships, whereby global north states, they continue to hold great sway over the development pathways of SIDS. So this colonial logic, I would argue, others have argued actually, is reproduced in the global climate governance. So climate finance is often conditional. It's tied to the priorities of donor nations. Eligibility for aid is based on per capita income metrics tourism dependent nations such as Antigua and Barbuda, what I'll be talking about, they're labeled as high income, which cuts them off from ODA, from official development assistance, even as a single hurricane can wipe out their GDP. And even though levels of poverty and vulnerability on the day-to-day, they still exist. So also negotiations at international forums like COP, they're consistently dominated by powerful states, resulting in what many SIDS in the last COP labelled as an escapist agenda, which avoids historical responsibility. So kind of to summarise the backdrop of what I'm speaking to is that the conventional story is one where SIDS are vulnerable, where solutions are technical, and where the historical architects or global north countries of the climate crisis, they dominate global responses and the climate action agenda. So this paper I'm presenting today, this work in progress, this world premiere of this paper, basically, it's starting from a different premise. So I'm trying to suggest that SIDS, they're not objects of global climate governance. They're also actively trying to reshape it. And I'm arguing that the recent diplomatic, legal, and financial initiatives can be understood as part of a much deeper political project, a project of world making. So, world making. Has anybody read this book? It's fantastic. It's like a masterpiece. It's based on historical archives of the aspirations of the mid-20th century anti-colonial nationalists in Africa and the Caribbean. And I'm drawing on this idea of world making by Adam Getachew, and she used it to describe, like I said, the ambitions of mid-20th century anti-colonial leaders in Africa and the Caribbean. So these figures, they didn't see decolonization as complete once formal independence was achieved. They recognized that newly independent states, even though alien control was removed, were being inserted into an international system still structured by deep economic and political inequality or hierarchies that would mean that their countries would continue to be dominated by former colonial powers. So she says that we kind of missed the trick here when we talk about decolonization. It's not just the first move, removal of alien control. They were saying we need to take a second move, which is restructuring the global order fundamentally. So we don't have what the former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, called fake independence. He said that we would be sovereignty in name, but continue domination in practice. So yeah, that's kind of like a key argument in her book. So by transforming the international economic and political order, post-colonial states aimed to ensure they were able to exercise genuine self-government, which they interpreted as non-domination, that guaranteed newly independent states could forge their own development pathways. So these anti-colonial nationalists, some photos here of some of them, many of whom are from the countries we now call SIDS, argued that realizing the international condition of non-domination needed to successfully self-govern required more than a defense of the state or a defense of the individual state. Rather, it would require delegating sovereignty beyond the nation state to form radical internationalisms that would pool their sovereignty and power to collectively resist the international order. So this is what Getachew understands as world making. So anti-colonial leaders pursued projects that went beyond the nation state. So a central strategy at the top here was the West Indies Federation from 1958 to 1962. And that was various islands in the Caribbean, leaders of various islands in the Caribbean that were part of the British Empire. And then you have the Union of African States, or the Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union, it's sometimes called. That was between 1958 and 1963. So they aim to offer an interstate and international political structure through which post-colonial states could secure non-domination. Many of these projects were actually short-lived, they failed. For example, Jamaica left the federation and it kind of dissolved. And Getaju argues that the heterogeneity across African states meant that it was not difficult to speak with one more voice or to form these federations. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make in this paper is that world making or decolonization was always about remaking the world, not just removing alien rule. That's Getachu's point. And the argument I'm trying to make in this paper, I'm trying to riff off or build on her idea, is that SIDS climate diplomacy echoes this early tradition. Contemporary SIDS are negotiating within a fixed climate regime. They're attempting I'll explain incremental, but I would say meaningful ways to reshape the normative, legal, and financial architecture of the global climate regime. And they're pursuing forms of collective action that seek to reduce domination, expand policy autonomy, and embed principles of equity and historical responsibility more firmly into global climate governance and to reduce vulnerability of SIDS globally. Okay. So just a little bit on how this paper also connects with a second body of work on reparative politics and resistance in the Caribbean. So you've got scholars like Yerima Bonilla, Keston Perry, and David Scott, who they view vulnerability not as a dead end, but they see it as a generative condition. So they say that in the wake of plantation economies, they argue that political life is found in everyday acts of survival, memory, and solidarity. Their work reframes resistance not as a dramatic singular event, but it's a continuous, often ordinary process of contesting power and reimagining alternatives that it actually emerges from vulnerability and injustices of post-colonialism. So basically the idea is that they're saying vulnerability can be a generative condition for resistance. And that's kind of one that the fuel, so to speak, for solidarity and for collective action. So that's the backdrop. They're kind of the lectures I was speaking to, and a little bit about where I went to do this research, who I spoke to. So I principally did my research in the Caribbean, in Antigua and Barbuda. So I interviewed post-colonial civil servants who are often overlooked, I feel, in a lot of studies on climate governance or even development projects, to be honest. But they're really important mid-level translators of like donors or development projects or the climate regime. So 21 interviews with civil servants across these 7 different ministries in Antigua and Barbuda, which is a really interesting country. It's a twin island country. That they were separate countries, but during decolonization in 1981, they formed a twin island country, very dependent on tourism, high income, according to the traditional ways of measuring GDP or development. And the Prime Minister, Gaston Brown, he's been kind of like a spearhead for the SIDS movement alongside other leaders in Tuvalu and Vanuatu, but he's really been pushing the agenda for SIDS for many, many years. And a little thing to note methodologically is that the civil servants were really candid. I'd spoken to about 15 of them in 2020, and I came back and interviewed again. Like, we often think that civil servants are really, I don't know, polite or really bureaucratic, but they were often adopting this really frank discussion, like really based on like anger and frustration, which I kind of just illustrating there with this one quote. So these are like mid-level translators of global climate governance, and they're responsible for designing and implementing national policy, and they're the ones who align projects with donor conditionalities, who write the funding proposals and who interface daily with the complex and often frustrating architecture of international aid and climate finance. So I'm kind of saying that they occupy this kind of strategic middle, and they're neither high-profile political leaders that we often see in the media negotiate on climate change, nor the local community activists, but they have a detailed and pragmatic understanding of how the global climate system constrains them and how it could be or should be reformed. So just we say this frankness in the interviews, people have asked about it before, like, gosh, that's really unusual for bureaucrats to be that frank and quite quite explicit in the anti-colonial like rhetoric, but it does mirror what SIDS leaders are doing globally now. If you kind of Google it, you see that there's not polite grievance. There's a willingness to be publicly assertive about historical injustices and moral responsibility. So it didn't really surprise me too much when I thought about it in that sense. All right, so just now the second half, we're going to think about the findings. So the first major finding is that the interviews had a shared explicit recognition of climate change as an expression of global historical inequality. So they consistently linked the island's present-day vulnerability to centuries of colonial extraction, and explain that how they're not just facing random climate hazards, they're facing the compounded climate repercussions of the history of colonialism. Like a colonialism that I've just said before, extracted resources and made them more vulnerable, and perversely, and this came from many of the civil servants, but perversely fueled the industrialization of global north countries to emit carbon, to increase carbon emissions, which now disproportionately impact SIDS. There was this link and the willingness to talk about it in those terms. So their understanding of shared historical experiences directly informs a rejection of methodological nationalism, which is basically the idea that the nation state is the primary container for political action. So they were fairly unequivocal that acting alone as SIDS, just an individual island country, is a recipe for continued domination and that global climate governance. So quotes kind of like this saying, look, our strength is working together, collectivizing our power and speaking as one voice on these issues. And they found strength in regional and transnational institutions such as the top here. You've got CARICOM for Caribbean Economic Integration, and crucially, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, which is it's an intergovernmental coalition of 39 low-lying coastal and small island nations established in 1990 to address the disproportionate impact of climate change. So they don't frame these as just lobbying groups. They see these as essential world-making infrastructures. And I'm suggesting in the paper, I'm trying to make the argument that we can see this as the contemporary equivalent of the West Indies Federation, in that they're pragmatic anti-colonial vehicles for pooling their power and amplifying SIDS voices. They're allowing SIDS, who are really heterogeneous, really diverse, with different cultures and economies, to pragmatically reconcile these differences and speak with a unified voice. To increase their structural bargaining power and global climate governance. So I'm arguing that the Alliance of Small Island States, for example, transform their SIDS shared condition of vulnerability and born out of colonial history into a foundation for collective grievance, agency and action. So the rest of the paper, I'm going to just lay out a suite of strategies that SIDS have carried out collectively to try and incrementally nudge the global climate regime to give SIDS greater self-determination over their climate and development futures. All right. So the first strategies I talked about is kind of legal. So one of the most famous kind of wins for example, is the Alliance of Small Island States were really instrumental in leading initiatives and substantive decisions to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in those original conversations many, many years ago. But more recently, so this top photo here, they're actually turning to the international courts, not just for redress, but to fundamentally try and rewrite the rules of responsibility. So top photo, July 2025, Vanuatu, representing SIDS, successfully requested that the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, issue a non-binding advisory opinion affirming that states have an obligation to protect the environment from greenhouse gas emissions. and that they may incur legal responsibility if they fail or ignore this duty. And then the bottom photo in 2024, the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change, co-led by Antigua and Barbuda, and Tuvalu, so that's Gaston Brown there on the right. They secured a landmark advisory opinion from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And this opinion stated that greenhouse gas emissions constitute marine pollution and that states have illegal obligations to prevent, reduce, and control this pollution. So this is strategic and translate fundamentally the moral argument that, you know, you broke it, you fix it, to put it really like frankly into like a legal principle. So again, you can see the quite explicit language that people were having about legal responsibility, the moral authority that people had, that SIDS have on this issue. But just to point out that they're not really like this. These advisory opinions are going to fundamentally change the global climate regime. You know, they're not pessimistic, hard-headed realists thinking, oh, it's going to make no difference. And they're not overly optimistic that we've got it, guys. We've got the ICJ advisory opinion. It's going to be changed. They're taking like a middle path. So they express like restraint on the potential legal ramifications for larger global north states or larger, more high emitting states, while also highlighting like the political strategic value of globally spotlighting the climate injustice that SIDS are subject to. So they see the political value in that, and that they're shifting the dial of the conversation. All right. Okay. If anyone has any questions halfway through, it's hard, isn't it, just speaking at people. If you do, you can always raise your hand or like say, Gemma, I need a break. Okay, so second, like sort of suite of strategies is financial. SIDS have been really interesting on like financial how vulnerability is measured. So I know I told you before about how a lot of SIDS are not eligible for ODA because they're seen as high income, and that cuts them off from a lot of aid that's necessary, especially for aid-dependent countries, which many of SIDS are. So they're trying to target the OECD's eligibility criteria for official development assistance, which I said uses per capita income to like gatekeep aid. So for SIDS with tourism dependent sectors such as Antigua and Barbuda, a lot of them are seen as high income and they're just cut off from ODA. So 2022, Antigua and Barbuda became high income. They can't get access to ODA, but there's still high levels of vulnerability. And that's despite and high levels of inequality. So this Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados. She said at COP29, this is like the economic noose of tightening fiscal space. But for over a decade, SIDS have been really innovating on collectively pushing for this multi-dimensional vulnerability index. Okay, so this is basically an alternative metric that incorporates climate risk and debt and economic exposure to assess eligibility for ODA, rather than just relying on GDP, as I said earlier. So this, in 2024, this succeeded when the UN General Assembly adopted the MVI. There's kind of a bit of a graphic of it here. So this is direct institutional reform. It's a change to the rules of the game, and it's forced through by SIDS solidarity. It worked collectively to make this change. It's still in its early stages. SIDS are working with the UN right now to think about how we're going to implement this. Right, what will it look like actually, and will it be picked up? It's still, again, sort of. I'll come back to maybe in a couple of years where we see a bit more of the impact. But again, it is institutional reform. They're also innovating around debt. So debt is a huge stranglehold on like post-colonial SIDS. And it's a huge stranglehold on their ability to adapt to climate change. So they've pioneered things like hurricane clauses and debt instruments. And now they're working through this, it's called the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS to establish a global debt sustainability support service. So that, again, that was in 2024. The idea is it's not just to give short-term disaster relief, but long-term restructuring to create a permanent fiscal space resilience. Again, this is early stages, so 2 more years and I'll follow up, but it's still it's changing the dial, it's changing the conversation, it's creating new institutions such as this, Global Debt Sustainability Service. So the third bit I want to talk about is diversification. So, like I said, there's this economic noose of tightening fiscal space. So SIDS has been really interesting in how they try to diversify their income for like post-colonial societies that are aid dependent. This is really important in the context of retreating Western aid. So faced with insufficient and conditional finance from traditional donors, SIDS have started pragmatically cultivating alternative partnerships and different ways of creating income. So this includes, quite controversial strategies like citizenship by investment, and deepening aid relationships with China. So here, this is Gaston Brown with Xi Jinping. I think that was last year, 2025. And then we have here, it's a huge port that was developed through partnership with China, and it's this deep water harbour port. It's to help become the biggest transshipment hub in the Eastern Caribbean. And a couple of times I did interviews to the civil service, they opened up their curtain and they pointed out, look at this transshipment hub we've got here, it's the biggest in the Caribbean. Quite energetic when talking about like these huge infrastructures like China. It's like building roads, hospitals, well, airports, stadiums, convention centres, a huge, absolutely humongous Chinese embassy as well. So, but they're also aware, again, like they're not being overly optimistic. They're also aware of like critiques of debt traps and eroded sovereignty, but they actually defended these choices as necessary tactics born of the post-colonial predicament. So many of SIDS have become aid dependent, but now Western aid is retreating, and it's retreating even further in the last couple of years. So China is actually widely welcomed by foreign affairs, tourism departments, and the infrastructure departments I spoke to. Fisheries and the environment are a little bit more cautious, like, the adverse impacts on our climate resilience are questionable because the destruction of mangroves, biodiversity. But interestingly, I also did speak to environmentalists, and I thought they'd be like, oh no, Chinese aid is really bad for the environment. But they were actually quite pragmatic too. They said, we get it. What we're going to do as a post-colonial country who needs aid, and we don't have as much access to aid, I kind of understand why our leaders are doing this. It's an imperfect choice that they're having to make. So they were having kind of a more of a generous analysis of why SIDS leaders would go for big infrastructure, which might be bad for climate resilience. And the civil servants they're not framing it like, oh, we're being passively integrated into China's global vision. Rather, they're seeing it as a strategic way to plug the gap left by retreating Western aid, and to leverage the geopolitical competition to like increase their room to maneuver within the international negotiations, or reduce their dependency on Western aid. So just a penultimate slide now. So just want to quickly highlight how some of the civil servants, I think maybe like 4 or 5, it wasn't all, but they did explicitly refer to or connect their contemporary actions to transform global climate governance to the long and often obscured history of Caribbean resistance. So from slave revolts to labour uprisings, and this is really, really took me by surprise, to be honest. They framed their climate diplomacy not as like a novel departure, but as the latest chapter in a centuries-long struggle for greater self-determination over their futures and development pathways. All right. And just finally, so just to draw us a conclusion, so Getachu's idea of world making, which I would really encourage you to read the book. It's one of the best books I've read in a good few years. It allows you to provide a more historically attuned analysis of how SIDS strategically and collectively resist and seek to reconfigure the entrenched power of global North states and institutions. And it helps to advance understandings of climate justice. So climate justice is not just about, distributing the allocation of adaptation funds. It's a relational and structural project of unsettling the colonial hierarchies embedded in the global climate order. And SIDS, this suite of strategies, I would argue, demonstrate that repair, means changing the rules of engagement, not just receiving compensation, not just getting adaptation finance, but changing the order of governance. And then with guidance by the people I was talking about before, Keston Perry, Yarima Bonilla, David Scott, and also Jonathan Pugh, based at Durham, their work on reparative politics and resistance shows how SIDS today, they're transforming historical loss, post-colonial non-sovereignty, structural vulnerability and dissatisfaction and anger, to put it bluntly, into new imaginaries and solidarities that try to remake the international climate order, and that emotions such as frustration, hope, and non-domination fuel transnational solidarity. Positioning SIDS collectively to resist technocratic global climate governance via alliances like the Alliance of Small Island States and CARICOM. And I'm trying to also say that it challenges these technocratic imaginaries of climate governance. So Remling's work says that imaginaries of climate governance, they're not just shaped by technical and political ideas or factors, but it's also shaped by people's climate imaginaries, are also shaped by emotional, ethical, and historical dimensions, which render certain governance models more attractive. And to conclude, so the story of SIDS, I'm trying to say in my elevator pitch now, is that the story of SIDS and climate change is not just one of vulnerability, it's also about an ongoing story of anti-colonial world making. SIDS are leveraging their solidarity, their moral authority, and their legal ingenuity to incrementally reconfigure the global climate regime. And that reminds us, in the words of Olufemi Taiwo, that the task of climate justice is no smaller than to remake the world. And that is what I'm trying to argue SIDS are seeking to do collectively through their strategies. Okay, thank you very much.